The farmer found a pregnant girl at the barn door. The mountain man said, "Feed her before I eat." The farmer found her just after dusk, standing at the edge of the barn door, as if she had been placed there by the fading light itself, her coat too thin for the cold, her hands braced against the wood to keep herself upright, and the unmistakable curve of her pregnancy pressing forward beneath a dress that had been mended too many times to hide its wear. She did not knock, did not call out, only waited with eyes lowered, as though asking for mercy without daring to name it. And when the farmer spoke, startled by her sudden presence, she flinched and whispered an apology before he had even asked her name. She told him she had walked since morning after being turned away from a nearby town, that the men there said she would be trouble once the baby came, that no one wanted another mouth to feed when winter was already tightening its grip. And with each word her strength slipped further until she had to lean fully against the doorframe to keep from falling. The farmer hesitated, not cruel but uncertain, knowing his own stores were thin and that taking her in would invite questions he was not prepared to answer. Yet before he could decide, the sound of heavy boots crossed the yard behind him, slow and deliberate, announcing the arrival of the mountain man, who had been staying in the loft these past weeks, a figure built broad and solid like the land itself, his beard dusted with frost and his eyes sharp with the habit of watching for danger. He took in the scene in a single glance, the woman's pale face, the way her body guarded the life inside her, the farmer's indecision. And something in his expression hardened not with anger, but with resolve. The farmer began to speak, explaining supplies, explaining risk, explaining winter. But the mountain man cut him off with a voice low and steady, saying only that hunger could wait and fear could wait, but a woman carrying a child could not, and that if there was food in the house, it would go to her first. The woman looked up then, startled by the certainty in his tone, and for the first time since arriving at the barn, her shoulders sagged as if permission to breathe had been granted. The farmer watched the mountain man set his rifle aside and move toward the door, not touching her, but guiding her gently inside with a hand held open. And though the farmer still feared what trouble might follow, he could not deny the rightness of what was happening. For the injustice was plain enough even to a man who had tried not to see it. A pregnant woman left to the cold because she was inconvenient, and a world too ready to turn away. As the door closed against the night and the first warmth reached her trembling hands, the mountain man stood watch by the wall, knowing full well that protection had just begun, and that the real threat would come not from hunger alone, but from those who believed mercy was weakness. The night settled quietly over the farm, and from the loft window, the mountain man watched the yard the way he always did, not expecting trouble, but refusing to be surprised by it. And as the farmer moved about the kitchen preparing a simple meal, the woman sat near the stove with her hands wrapped around a tin cup, the warmth bringing color slowly back to her face. She spoke little at first, answering only what was asked, explaining that she had been working at a rail stop until her condition showed that the man responsible had vanished, and that once the baby became visible, she was no longer seen as a person, but as a problem to be moved along. The farmer listened with unease, shifting his weight as though her story itself carried risk, while the mountain man remained silent above them, hearing everything and measuring not the woman's words, but the pattern he had seen too many times before. Fear dressed as law, convenience masquerading as judgment. Later, when the farmer stepped outside to check the animals, the mountain man came down the ladder and sat across from the woman, not crowding her, not questioning her worth, only asking how far she had walked and whether the child had been moving that day. Practical questions spoken gently. She answered honestly, admitting she had not felt the baby since morning and that she had been afraid to stop walking in case no other door would open. And at that, the mountain man's jaw tightened, not with anger toward her, but toward the world that had made endurance her only option. He told her she would stay the night and the next, and that no one would force her back onto the road while he was present. Words that did not promise a future, but secured the moment. And she nodded, relief settling over her like a blanket she had not known she needed. From the doorway, the farmer watched this exchange with growing awareness, seeing in the mountain man's calm authority a clarity he himself had lacked. And for the first time, he understood that witnessing injustice carried its own responsibility. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed against the walls, reminding them all how thin shelter could be. And as the woman rested back in her chair, eyes finally closing, the mountain man took his place by the door again, standing guard not because danger had arrived, but because he knew it eventually would. And when it did, this night, this quiet decision to see and not turn away would be the line drawn against it. The rescue came before sunrise, when the farm still slept beneath a thin layer of frost, and the quiet was broken by the sound of horses stopping too close to the house, their hooves crunching deliberately in the gravel as if meant to be heard. And the mountain man knew at once this was no passing rider. He moved without haste, lifting his rifle but not shouldering it, listening as voices carried from the yard, 2 men, maybe 3, speaking with the sharp impatience of those who believed authority traveled with them. The farmer reached the door first, pulling it open just enough to see the men who had followed the woman from the town, claiming she owed work, claiming she had no right to stop, claiming that her condition made her unreliable and therefore subject to being returned. Before the farmer could answer, the woman appeared behind him, drawn by the raised voices, her hand resting instinctively over her belly, as fear returned to her eyes, and one of the riders pointed toward her, saying she belonged back where she could be watched. The mountain man stepped forward then, placing himself between the doorway and the yard, his presence filling the space without a single threat spoken. And he told the men plainly that no one would be taking her anywhere while she was under his watch, that the road they followed ended at this fence. One rider laughed nervously and said a mountain man had no claim here, but the mountain man answered that protection did not require ownership, only resolve, and that if they wished to press the matter, they would do so knowing they were choosing force over reason. The farmer found his voice at last, adding that the woman had been invited inside and would stay until she was strong enough to decide her own path. Words that surprised even him with their firmness. The riders hesitated, weighing the cost of pushing further against the stillness of the man before them, and after a tense moment, one spat into the dirt and turned his horse away, muttering that trouble followed women like this. As they rode off, the woman sagged slightly, the fear draining from her body now that it had nowhere to land, and the mountain man lowered his rifle, telling her the danger had passed for now. He guided her back inside without touching her, letting her choose each step, and as the door closed behind them, the rescue settled into what it truly was. Not a fight won, but a stand taken early enough to keep one from happening, and a line drawn clearly between mercy and harm. After the riders disappeared beyond the far trees, the farm seemed to breathe again, the tension loosening from the walls as morning light crept through the small windows and settled across the kitchen floor. And the woman sat quietly at the table, while the farmer placed bread and broth before her, unsure what else to do except offer what he had. The mountain man watched from the doorway, satisfied for the moment that danger had moved on, then set his rifle aside and took a seat on the bench against the wall, not joining the meal but remaining close enough that his presence was felt. The woman ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might be taken back. And when the farmer urged her to take more, she hesitated before nodding, the simple act of being offered choice bringing a faint steadiness to her hands. Warmth returned to her face as the minutes passed, and she spoke softly about the child, about fear of the road and the long nights spent listening for footsteps that might send her running again. And the farmer listened with his head lowered, recognizing how easily he might have been one more door that stayed closed. The mountain man said little, but when he did, it was practical and grounding, telling her she could rest through the day, that the loft had clean blankets, and that no one would ask anything of her until she was ready. Words that carried no conditions. Later, as the sun climbed and the frost melted from the grass, the woman lay down and slept for the first time, without bracing herself to flee, her breathing deep and even. While the farmer moved about his chores with a quiet purpose, bringing fresh water and tending the animals with renewed attention, the mountain man took his post outside, scanning the tree line and the road beyond the fence, aware that safety was not permanent but earned moment by moment. And as he stood there, he felt no hunger despite skipping the meal, knowing he had chosen rightly. By midday, the house had settled into a calm rhythm shaped by small, respectful acts. Food shared, silence honored, rest protected. And though none of them spoke of what might come next, the woman's strength slowly returning made it clear that this haven, however temporary, was real. In that fragile peace, the mountain man understood that shelter was more than walls and warmth. It was the deliberate refusal to let fear decide who deserved to stay alive and cared for. And for this day at least, that refusal held firm. By late afternoon, the woman was sitting upright again, wrapped in a clean blanket with her back against the wall, watching the farmer move about the yard through the open door. And though her body was still tired, her eyes carried a steadiness that had not been there the night before. The mountain man remained nearby, mending a torn strap with slow, practiced hands. And when she spoke, it was to thank him not for saving her, but for not speaking over her when the men came. A distinction that mattered more than she knew how to explain. He answered simply that people who had already lost control over their lives deserved it, returned, not replaced. And the quiet certainty in his voice eased something tight in her chest. She told him her name and where she came from, speaking of a family scattered by sickness and work, of moving from place to place until there was nowhere left to be wanted, and of learning to keep her head down so as not to invite attention that never led to kindness. The mountain man listened without interruption, nodding once when she finished, and told her she would not be forced into decisions while she recovered, that she could leave when she chose or stay until she felt steady enough to walk the road again. The farmer joined them then, admitting awkwardly that fear had nearly made him turn her away, and she met his gaze without anger, saying she understood fear well, and that what mattered was what he had done after seeing her clearly. As the light shifted toward evening, the woman felt the child move again, a gentle reassurance that life had not been lost in the long walk. And when she mentioned it quietly, relief passed between all three of them without celebration. The mountain man stood and said he would check the perimeter before nightfall, not because danger had shown itself again, but because trust grew best when paired with vigilance. As he stepped outside, the woman watched him go and realized that trust was not born from grand promises or dramatic rescues, but from small consistencies. Meals given first, space respected, protection offered without claim. She leaned back against the wall, breathing more easily now. And though the future remained uncertain, a bond had formed that day, not of dependence, but of mutual recognition. Shaped by the simple truth that dignity shared freely had a way of steadying even the most fragile beginnings. The threat returned at dusk, not with shouting, but with the slow confidence of men who believed the road belonged to them. And the mountain man saw the dust first, rising beyond the fence line in a way that told him this time there were more riders than before. He signaled the farmer quietly and moved to the front of the house as 3 men approached on horseback. Their expressions hardened by the kind of authority that grew impatient when it was questioned. And they announced they had come to collect the woman, claiming she was avoiding responsibility and that her condition made her a burden no homestead could afford to shelter. Inside, the woman heard their voices and felt fear press back against her chest, but she remained seated, remembering the mountain man's words and the way the day had unfolded without force. The farmer stepped forward first, his voice shaking but firm as he said she had been invited to stay and would not be moved against her will. A declaration that surprised even him, while the riders laughed and said he had no standing to decide such things. Then the mountain man spoke, his voice low and even, stating that anyone wishing to take her would first have to explain themselves in daylight before witnesses, and that no man would lay a hand on her in the dark when fear did most of its damage. One rider shifted his horse closer, testing the distance. But the mountain man did not move, his stillness making clear that any further step would be a choice made deliberately. The men exchanged looks, frustration flickering as they realized the situation was no longer simple, that the presence of a witness and a man unwilling to be rushed had turned their confidence brittle. They warned that they would return with papers and more men, turning their horses sharply and riding off with threats trailing behind them like smoke. As the sound faded, the farmer closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard while the woman rested her hand on her belly and steadied herself, understanding now that danger did not always come loudly and that courage was often required more than once. The mountain man took his place outside again, eyes on the road, knowing the true declared threat was not the riders who had left, but the certainty that they would come back expecting obedience, and that when they did, the choices made tonight would matter more than any weapon carried at the door. That night, the farm felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening, and the mountain man sat alone on the bench by the door, weighing the shape of the danger that had brushed past them twice now without fully revealing itself. For he knew men who returned with papers often returned with something sharper as well. Inside, the woman lay awake, her hands folded over her belly, wrestling not only with fear of the riders, but with a deeper uncertainty about staying, wondering whether her presence would draw trouble that the farmer and the mountain man did not deserve, and whether moving on before dawn might spare them consequences she could already imagine. When she spoke, it was quietly, telling the farmer she could leave if needed, that she had learned how to keep walking even when it hurt, and the words struck him harder than any threat from outside, because they revealed how accustomed she was to being the one who made herself small to keep others safe. The farmer turned away, ashamed that his first instinct days ago had been to protect his supplies rather than a person, and he admitted he did not know how to be brave in matters like this, only that he could not bear to send her back into the cold, knowing what waited there. The mountain man joined them then, hearing enough to understand the conflict forming between caution and compassion. And he spoke plainly, saying fear could inform decisions but must never command them, and that choosing the easier road now would teach those men that pressure worked. The woman listened, torn between gratitude and responsibility, confessing she did not want protection that came at the cost of someone else's safety. And the mountain man answered that protection freely given was not a debt to be repaid, but a duty once accepted. Silence followed, heavy but not hostile, and in it each of them faced a private reckoning, the woman with her worth, the farmer with his courage, and the mountain man with the knowledge that standing firm might soon require more than words. When the woman finally said she would stay the night and face the morning honestly rather than flee in the dark, the decision settled over them like a line drawn in the dirt, fragile but real. The mountain man rose and took his place by the window again, The farmer banked the fire, and the woman closed her eyes, knowing the road ahead was uncertain, but also knowing that for the first time since the child had begun to grow inside her, she was not making her choice alone. The sacrifice came quietly at first light. When the mountain man saddled his horse and told the farmer he would ride to the nearest township to bring back witnesses before the riders returned with darkness on their side, knowing full well that leaving would thin the protection at the farm and place the burden of courage on others. The farmer objected, arguing that staying together was safer. But the mountain man answered that courage sometimes meant moving toward trouble early, so it could not grow teeth later. And he asked the farmer to stand firm, to keep the door closed if needed, and to remember that mercy required a spine. Before mounting, the mountain man spoke briefly with the woman, not promising safety but explaining the plan plainly, giving her the dignity of knowing what risk was being taken and why. And she nodded, telling him she trusted his judgment and would not mistake his absence for abandonment. The ride was long and cold, the mountain man pushing his horse through low valleys and shallow creeks, rehearsing what he would say to men who preferred papers to people. And when he reached the township, he went first to the justice of the peace, then to the midwife, who knew the cost of long walks and late pregnancies, gathering names willing to stand as witnesses should force be attempted again. Back at the farm, the farmer felt the weight of the mountain man's absence like an exposed nerve. Yet when the riders returned near noon, louder and more certain, he held his ground, stating clearly that the woman would speak for herself, and that daylight had a way of revealing truth. The woman stepped into view then, supported by the doorway but steady in her voice, telling the men she was staying by choice and that any attempt to move her would be answered before witnesses. And the riders hesitated, unsettled by the clarity of her words and the farmer's refusal to be rushed. When the mountain man returned at dusk with 2 townsmen and the midwife riding behind him, the standoff broke not with force, but with accountability. The riders seeing their advantage dissolve as names, eyes, and consequences gathered. In that moment, courage showed its true shape, not in standing alone with a weapon, but in coordinating truth early enough that violence never found a foothold. Justice arrived without spectacle the next morning, when the justice of the peace and the midwife spoke plainly before the gathered riders, naming the woman's condition, her right to choose her shelter, and the clear line between assistance and coercion. And as the word settled, the riders' confidence thinned into unease. For daylight and witnesses had a way of stripping authority down to its truth. The woman stood beside the farmer, her posture steady, answering questions herself rather than letting others speak for her. And when she said she had been pressured to move on because she was inconvenient, the silence that followed carried the weight of recognition. The mountain man remained slightly behind her, present but not looming, understanding that justice here meant union around her voice, not around his strength. The justice of the peace declared that no one would remove her against her will, that any further harassment would be answered by law, and that arrangements would be made for care and safe passage should she later choose to travel. A ruling that shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. The riders protested briefly, then fell quiet as the midwife confirmed the risks of forcing a pregnant woman back onto the road. And with no ground left to stand on, the men turned away one by one, their departure marked not by defeat, but by the absence of permission to harm. When the yard finally cleared, the farmer let out a long breath he had been holding for days, and the woman rested a hand over her belly, feeling the child move as if acknowledging the change. The mountain man met the justice's eyes and thanked him for coming early rather than late, a choice that had kept blood from the ground. And the justice nodded, reminding them all that law worked best when summoned before fear had time to harden. As the witnesses departed, the 3 remained together in the quiet that followed, not bound by ownership or obligation, but by the shared work of standing firm. And in that stillness, a union took shape, not of romance, but of purpose, where each had played a role in restoring order without breaking anyone's dignity, and where justice had been served by listening first to the one most at risk. In the weeks that followed, the farm settled into a steady rhythm shaped not by fear, but by intention. And the woman grew stronger with each passing day, her steps more certain, her breath easier, as care replaced endurance as the measure of her survival. She worked when she chose and rested when she needed, learning the land's quiet patterns while the farmer ensured food and warmth without treating her presence as a burden. And the mountain man remained nearby, sometimes riding out for days at a time, sometimes sitting on the fence at dusk, watching the horizon with the patience of someone who understood that peace required upkeep. No one hurried her decisions or spoke of futures she had not named. And in that freedom, she found her voice settling into confidence rather than defiance, choosing to stay through the season and accept the midwife's care without surrendering her independence. The farmer discovered a steadiness he had not known he possessed, no longer weighing kindness against scarcity, but understanding that mercy practiced early saved far more than it cost. And the mountain man found satisfaction not in being needed, but in knowing he had helped create a place where need did not become exploitation. Word of what had happened traveled quietly, carrying with it a warning that this farm was not a place where pressure worked, and the road beyond the fence grew less interested in testing that truth. On a clear morning, as the woman stood in the doorway, watching the sun rise over the fields, she thanked the mountain man not for protection, but for insisting she be fed first, a moment that had told her everything she needed to know about her worth in this place. He nodded once, saying that hunger and fear had a way of clouding judgment, and that clearing them was often the first act of justice. Life continued without ceremony, but with purpose, each day reinforcing the simple order they had chosen to uphold. And in that order, the child grew. The land yielded, and the past loosened its grip, leaving behind not a story of rescue, but a story of dignity restored through quiet, deliberate care. Real strength shows itself in who we choose to protect first. Thank you for walking this quiet road of mercy and resolve with us. May your kindness always arrive before your comfort.